Good day, everyone, and welcome to my studio. My name is Andrea, and I have been watching your beautiful work on this page for a little bit now. I keep seeing sort of the same questions coming up from a bunch of people, mainly in regards to landscape painting and acrylic. And I just wanted to sort of give a few pointers because I'm sort of seeing the same struggles over and over. And to be honest, there's stuff that I struggled with a lot when I was just sort of starting out. And there's just like a few key things that you can think about before you start your painting that are actually just going to make it a lot easier. And you'll find that you manage to improve your painting skills pretty quickly. And actually, most of this doesn't even have that much to do with applying paint and brush strokes. It's sort of like a few easier reflexes that you can develop in the beginning process that are just going to make everything a lot easier. So some of those things are basically creating depth in the landscape, and greens are always a big problem. And then also just organizing the space, so sort of compositional sort of things. So I'm just going to do like a little quick paint, and I'm going to show you some things in Photoshop, and I hope that they're helpful for you. I am not some like authority on anything, but I've just been sort of painting for a long time. You can see some of my work back there. I have a bachelor in painting and stuff, so I'm like a little bit qualified, but you know, that's just how it is. I just really like helping people and seeing them improve and be really happy with themselves. So I just wanted to share the knowledge that I do have with you guys and hope that it helps. So let's dive into a little tutorial, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks, guys. Okay, so one of the first things that I notice when I'm looking at people's paintings and sort of where they're struggling is usually just that when you're looking at a reference like this is a beautiful photograph of like a British landscape here. There's a lot of detail, and even this one, it's already softened actually, but a lot of our reference images just have a lot of detail, and the camera is not good at editing for you. So when I look at an image that I want to paint, I'm constantly asking myself what the image is about. In my case, it's usually lighting. I like to paint lighting. I'm aiming for that. I'm not where I want to be exactly, but that's what I'm aiming for. So I did kind of pick a cheap image for you here where I've got the bright sunlight, but it could be about the stream, it could be about the light. You just have to make a decision in the beginning, and then you work around that. So we're just going to say that it's the light here, but as you can notice, we have this image with a lot of detail, but a serious amount of green. And how are you going to make this really interesting? This basically just looks like a whole tube of sap green. One thing I also want to note is that I had already removed this tree. It's maybe overkill, but it does sort of, if I look at the leading lines right now of this image, I have this stream that comes in and points to this tree. Now it does kind of create something interesting that helps to bring the eye up here to our point. So there's a bit of an S curve going on here, so I'll draw it out for you. Okay, there is an S curve that brings our eye in here and up here. So that's perfect because we have a leading line that comes into the canvas, kind of meanders around, and then brings us to our focal point. So that's pretty easy and awesome in this particular case. I would say the fatal flaw of this photograph, though, is that, excuse me, my focal point is right in the middle of the canvas. It's not the end of the world, but it's not ideal. So in Photoshop, if I use the crop tool, you can set it. There's like all of these functions up here, and I always just have it set to the rule of thirds or to the golden ratio. You'll notice they're pretty close. So this one is probably working a little bit more on the golden ratio than the rule of thirds. Rule of thirds is easy for you guys. Just keep it there. The other thing is you don't need to be exact about this. Your main features of your image just need to sit around or close to those points. So if I wanted to get really picky about this, I might crop my image. Let me see. And I could even come up here. And I'm missing some of the stuff over here, but I'm also sort of zooming in a bit, but I'm putting the focal point at the rule of third, and conveniently, the bottom half here, or the bottom third, is the stream, and it actually takes up about 2/3. So if I like, let's do this. I am going to put some rulers here. I'm just dragging them across here, and I always just do this. If you don't have Photoshop, you can just kind of eyeball this. I don't always use Photoshop. I do this in my sketchbook also. And then I'm going to do my extras so that I can see it and not my grid. All right, so now we just have the rule of thirds here. So I've got my tree is on one, and if we look sort of on a larger level, this tree is now taking up a whole top 2/3 of this. So let me just do like a little, just so you guys can kind of see how this works and sort of my logic when I'm looking at references. So this tree takes up most of this. And then actually here, my water or my stream takes up most of this bottom third. So I'll just do that a different color. And then my focal point takes up that section. So I'm basically like really structuring my rule of thirds here to make something that's interesting. Like I mentioned, this one tree could be problematic. We can remove it. I just use the generative fill from the new AI tools in Photoshop. So right now I still have this shape coming up here, and the fact that there's some little bushes in this background here still brings that eye up, but I've left more open space to create some depth, and I just find it to be a little bit less cluttered as a composition. So don't be afraid to remove things or change the location of things in your references to support your final vision. The other thing is, right now, this stream comes here and then it just cuts off. I could allow this to just kind of go back a little bit more into the painting. It's subtle, but it doesn't block me at this point, and it doesn't detract from bringing my eye up to this sunshine. You can then add a cloud if you feel like it. Okay, so I've got sort of something a little bit new based on my reference photo. I don't love this. It's not the end of the world. You could actually have the water coming this way, but you actually want to avoid putting details and things in the corners. As much as possible, leave those as plain as you can. So actually, this is kind of creating a vignette in here, which is perfect. I can also, with my sky gradation, create sort of vignettes in the corner. And this is fine. I'll just leave that as is. It's just a little bit of green patch. It's nothing too distracting. I don't want to detail that too much. I don't want people really looking there because it can sort of pull people off of the canvas. So another thing that I've noticed, generally speaking, is that there's sort of like a lack of understanding, I guess, of value structure and how they work in landscapes. So, sorry, I got a little bit distracted with a phone call, but so what I was going to say was the value structure is really important for creating depth. And these are pretty much some hard and fast rules for landscape. The only time I will say that it can be different is if it's a completely snow-covered day, because snow is very white and reflective, so that can change the value structure of what I'm going to say. But if I turn this into black and white, you can already see very clearly that the brightest area, I'm going to type this out for you guys so you've got it as notes. The sky is the brightest, okay? Absolutely. You want to make sure that the sky is the brightest, and there's almost always a gradient in the sky where it is lighter at the bottom and darker at the top. Likewise, in terms of color temperature, it is more a yellow blue towards the bottom and a purple blue towards the top. So if you can remember that, that'll be very helpful. I really hate this. All right. The next thing, the next brightest thing, oops, is water. Okay, water is the next brightest. It is not quite as bright as the sky, but we can see in these bottom parts in here and in here, this is getting close, but it is a touch darker except for this one reflective bright spot. And I always leave these whites until the last. I want to keep everything away from white in value as far as possible. until the end, and then those are for my absolute highlights. So for example, this area, I need to have enough value contrast between the sky and this to make this pop. So even on this one I'm painting, I'm going to knock it a little bit darker so that I give space for this to read as something that is bright. Same with this, I might knock it a little bit darker than what I see right here, just so that when I go to add some detail over top, I have some room to make that show. So there's that. The next thing that is the brightest in a landscape is the ground. So everything that's grass. Grass, paths, so anything that is facing directly up to the sky is the next brightest thing. In this case, there's a lot of hills. This gets into my next rule, but you'll notice back in this area, which is the part that is facing straight up at the sky, this is the next brightest. In here, in here, in this area, these are the next brightest areas in the image, in the painting, okay? So the ground and grass, anything that is facing the sky, and this will often take on some color of the skylight, so you can always add some of that into your highlights. Okay, so the next thing is mountains or hills are the next lightest. Oops. So anything that is curving like this or is on an angle will be receiving less skylight because the angle. So it is the next darkest thing. And then the darkest thing in your painting are going to be the trees. Anything that is standing upright, like fence posts or rocks that have steep angles that are basically straight up and down. So that is how the value structure works in these landscapes. And this is basically a hard and fast rule. You can pretty much just use this without thinking. If you nail this, you are already going to have sort of a more easy to read, I guess, final painting. The other thing to notice is that the value difference between the background and the foreground is quite different. So if I look at my lightest light in my background versus my darkest dark, they're very close together. So when you're creating depth and distance, you want to make sure that you bring this value contrast closer together. And the farther back you go, the lighter this gets. So if I were to do like a little mountain back in there somewhere, I might take this gray, let's see, and I might bring this up. So actually that's going to be my lightest light. Yeah, it'll probably be all right because I need enough room for the sky, right? So that would be the lightest light in the next like mountain pass back. And then my darkest dark might be something like this, or even a little bit lighter to again narrow that value contrast difference. And then in the foreground, if I look at my lightest light, let's say it's this one. So this is my foreground. That's my lightest light. But my darkest dark is like this. So that is a really big value contrast for the foreground. So that's another thing to remember as you're creating depth. You want to make sure that your lightest light and darkest dark in your foreground area are really far apart. And then in your background areas and the distance areas, this value contrast goes lighter and it goes closer together. Okay, so the other thing that I notice in structure is that there's a lot of sort of emphasis on detail, and details are not what are going to make your painting read. Those are the juicy, fun things that you put on top of the painting, but it's better to see your work or your image in its most basic shapes first. So like, for example, if I were to draw this tree out, I might just give myself an overall shape. And the other thing is you do want your you do want your silhouettes and your edges to be easy to read, simple and easy to read. So I don't want to create a silhouette that is too complicated. Guys, this is also going to help you with drawing too. If you can break your images down like this, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to draw these things, because you're just thinking about basic shape. So this is the basic shape of that tree. There's no detail on it right now. I've reduced it even further, but you get the idea. And then, so for this one, it is a bit farther back, and you can change these silhouettes. Like if I don't really like this, I can go in and sort of add some more variation. And I know that this is farther back, so I am not going to do, I'm not going to do a black. I am going to do a gray to give me that sense of distance. So it's already going to push it backwards. So you want to go, let me see, grasses. This is another thing. When I see like paintings of rivers and paths and things, don't do a straight line. You have all of this opportunity here to create some overlapping shapes to make that interesting. So this is actually kind of like a light area. So let's say we want this to be in sun. Actually, I'm just going to do this in. So let me see. We don't see this right now very well because it's so light, but that could be sort of your shape for your grasses, and let these sort of come over your path. The more overlapping that you can do in your perspective, the more depth you will create. So here I just did the same thing. I desaturated it, but I removed the noise. So we can see these in sort of more clearly defined shapes without getting sort of confused, I guess, by the overall detail of the image. So that's sort of what I do when I'm looking at references, just as a foundational aspect. So you want to create leading lines. You want to decide what is your subject and where it is. It's ideal if that's around a rule of third. You want to kind of break up your image in rule of thirds like this and watch where your leading lines are go. How are you bringing people through the painting and where are they going? And a little hint too is that if you can exaggerate things in your image. So if I were to take this as an example, actually, let me grab some red. If I'm going to take this as an example, this tree, it's a little bit big. I could exaggerate it so it's pointing into this way. So I could actually, in the silhouette, kind of curve it out a bit more. And I could even turn this into a different clump, you know, like I could have a tree like this, and then maybe some branches, whoops, maybe some trunks in here, and then have this actually turn into sort of two different trees, and then have this kind of leaning a little bit this way to help point the eye in towards the sun. And like this tree is kind of already doing it, so it's good, but you can totally exaggerate these. So you can have your water, it's coming this way, you can have it really like coming in to point up to your sun. Again, these little bushes that are over here, I wouldn't want to put too much detail on these because I don't want to bring the viewer out here, but all of these little branches, it's good if they lean up toward your focal point. Any clouds in here, you want to create silhouettes that are pointing here. And like, you don't have to be too obvious about this, but the more that you sort of lead the eye, and you see even these grasses, we've got these tufts of grass, you can have some that are kind of pointing in this way, right? So within these areas of detail, you can direct the viewer's eye to your focal point. So all of these little things will just help to create a cohesive image. And they're not too obvious, but they do help to show people where to look. And it's easy to give people, it's easier for people to understand your image if you give them a point to rest on and a point to go to. So all of this will lead in here, and then the eye will go from here and wander around all the detail. So that is image structure. really important to try to think about these from the beginning. It's going to help everyone make more decisions through the process that are going to lead to stronger paintings in the end. So there is the shape language, the composition, keeping the rule of thirds is the easiest way to go, and the value structure. Those are the three main things that, like, if you aim for those and understanding how those are working in your reference and you kind of tweak them from the beginning, it's going to be smooth sailing after that. So in this next part, we're just going to get into some basic sort of drawing and blocking out a color, but mixing greens, because I've noticed that mixing greens is sort of like a hot topic, and it's something that is quite challenging, especially in a painting that looks like it is all sap green. Okay, so I'm just going to do this as an 8x10, and I'm just using a handy book of, let me see, which one is it? This is Real Canvas. These are quite handy. It is the FQ Canvas Pad by Try Arts. I like to do my little studies on this, and I'm just using some Dessert acrylic markers. So I just marked off 8x10. And the other thing that I can do right now, because this is a study, I'm just going to make this quick and dirty. But I'm going to add sort of my rule of third lines to help me organize. And I have them, as you know, on my reference image. And again, guys, you don't need to be crazy mathematical about this. Some people are crazy mathematical about this, but I'm not sure it's really all that necessary. As long as you're somewhere in the ballpark of these lines, you're going to be fine. So don't stress too much. I just got oil paint all over my finger. 2 seconds. Okay, so as I mentioned, I've got my rule of thirds, and they help me to anchor my points to draw also. So, and you know what? I'm just going to go in with my acrylic marker right now. These are great. You can paint directly over them. I do pretty much all of my sketching for my paintings in these. I have a whole video. I will link to it. It's for an oil painting, but it's transferring drawings, so it's the same thing. And again, remember I mentioned we want to keep simple shapes. So that is my first sort of little grass bit. And I'm just looking where they sort of intersect my rule of thirds. And then I've got that little bush coming up over here. And you want to kind of keep these shapes simple. This is not about detailing. This is about creating a solid foundation for a painting. So I'm just kind of looking where my elements cross. There's like some stones in here, but I don't need to go overkill with this. This is detailing too much even at the moment. So I am just going to continue. There's that grass clump that comes up over into here. Again, simple shapes, nice simple shapes. Over here, my grass comes up and it just starts touching this rule of third. Actually, it's a little bit lower. Doesn't matter too much. I can adjust this later, and then my hill comes up. So you'll notice too, when you're doing this, it becomes a lot easier to draw because you're not worried about detail. You're just worried about shape, and big shapes especially. So I've got my tree that's kind of coming up into here. Simplify these shapes. You don't need to go overkill with them. And I know that my light source is over here. You know what? I'm just going to mark this in because this is the most important thing. This is where my sun is going to go. And I know that I want my lines to be leading over here. And remember, I was sort of drawing those out with the lasso tool, quick and dirty, to create that silhouette. So I can literally just draw around my sun here. I don't want too much going on in the corners because I don't want to lead people off. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then there's some sort of branches and things. So that's good for a tree. I don't need to do more than this right now. I think, you know, if you do a bunch of quick studies like this, just to sort of get the hang of things, they don't take a long time. And it really is going to help you to improve a lot more quickly and just develop those reflexes for making stronger images. And then you're just going to spend a lot less time trying to paint. Like, you won't have to keep trying to put layers on paintings to fix things that are actually structural. You can actually waste a lot of time just continually putting layers on things that won't be fixed with layers. They're structural issues. They need to be fixed with structural solutions. I'm just going to raise this up a little bit. And then, let me see, that's this. So my water kind of disappears around here. And there's some little tufts and some stuff happening back there. But I might actually bring this over a little bit here to overlap that a little bit farther and narrow it. And then there's just some like rocks and things in here, some water patterns. This is another thing, the pattern of water. So there's going to be reflection happening here. And this is another thing where I can use this line in these areas to sort of point up to my focal point. And then in the back here, this is another thing. Try to keep your silhouettes kind of interesting. So you want to vary these lines and shapes as much as possible. And then let me see, this kind of comes up. There's more hills that kind of come up in over here. And there's some plants. And then there's sort of, it kind of comes across here. And they're smaller because they're farther away. But again, interesting shapes. There's a bit of a hill crest down here. So I've kind of pushed up a little bit on this. It's probably not a big deal. I'm partially not paying enough attention because I'm filming. But if I needed to later, if it was really messing with my perspective, I could drop that down. So like I would just know that my tree, instead of coming all the way up here, it sort of finishes in there. And then again, if I wanted some clouds in here, I can create some subtle shapes that, again, I would have them. And I like to sort of follow the perspective with my clouds too. So if I'm sort of faking this as my perspective point and I have other clouds in here, I might have them sort of pointing down in this direction just to create some movement in my canvas. So I want shapes coming up here, shapes coming up here, shapes coming over here, and shapes coming here to highlight my focal point. So that's sketching. If you can manage to do your sketches as simply as this, it's going to make your life way easier. Don't worry about the detail first. We'll do detail later. If you want to, you don't even have to. I'm going to see if I can find I kind of wish I had a grayscale of these markers. There's some sort of lighting areas. Actually, you know what? I'm going to take a yellow or like a light color just to mark out. And you know what? I'm just going to take a light green. I'm going to take a light green marker because another really interesting thing about landscape painting are the shadows. You can use shadows to dramatic effect. So over here, this is all in light, essentially. And this is all in light. And we've got some light patches here. Now, the really important one, I think, that I want to block out right now is the one that's kind of coming around this tree. So this one is really important. And see how it just becomes easy to structure your painting? And then, you know, there's all the light back in here. There's some highlights in here and along here, but this gets into like picky detail, and I don't want to get into that yet, but I will sort of follow some of that. And then there's sort of like a flat surface up in here. And then all of these are going to get lighter and more orange actually as they get closer to the sun. So that's like, oh, this is also facing straight upright. So I'm going to just add some green in there. And then shadows, the best color to tint your shadows are your purples. So if there is a shadow under the tree here, do this in here. I don't want to go overkill on this though. This might be getting too much even. This is quite a bit of planning, but it will help you to kind of understand how things are moving around the canvas. And then obviously these are all in shadow, right? Because they're standing upright. I have to treat the value later, but in the tree, obviously. And then in here, there's shadow. Again, you want to create some interesting shapes. Here's another thing. With painting, you kind of want to alternate light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. We can get into that later, but it also helps it read. But now we've got sort of a basic idea of how our painting's going to go. Now the rest of it is all about mixing greens, and I am going to get my paint out and we are going to mix up some interesting greens that are going to help bring depth to this painting and make it more interesting than a painting that is done in all sap green. Okay, so these are the paints that I'm using, and this is my typical palette for painting. Always a white, obviously, titanium white. However, if you have a zinc white, it is for mixing and blending if you don't want to knock out the color. With the titanium, because it's quite opaque and it can really desaturate your colors, which is important to know for building depth. Ivory black. I actually use this to mix my greens primarily. Ultramarine blue and cerulean blue. This is a purple blue. This is a sort of yellow blue. This is the one that I use closer to my horizon. I create my gradient towards the top of my sky with my ultramarine blue. Quinacridone magenta is my magenta red, so it's more to the purple blue spectrum. Pyrrole orange is my orange red. So I always have a warm and a cool of each color. And then I've got my cadmium free yellow light. It is neither too purple nor, or sorry, it is neither neither too orange nor too blue. It's kind of in the middle and it's quite bright. And it is also opaque, so it holds its own well enough in my other colors. So if I'm going to go to the trouble of mixing greens for this painting, I tend to like to use flat paintbrushes. They just work best for me. And I always start, first of all, let's just start with the sky, okay? So I always take a very small amount of my cerulean or my greeny or yellowy blue. And like I said, this needs to be the lightest part of the painting, but it also needs to be dark enough that I can give my focal point room to breathe. So like this could be an interesting color to start with, but it's already maybe a little bit interesting because there is a warm glow that is happening on the horizon. So I'm just going to take a little bit of this color and I'm going to, just on the side of it, mix a tiny little bit of yellow and a little bit of orange. And then maybe a little bit more white because that actually pushes closer to white. So I'm getting something that's a little bit more desaturated. And a tiny little bit more warm than this color and a tiny bit lighter. So I'm actually just going to take this right now and lay this out. And I'm not going to be able to do it right now because I don't have my Stay Wet palette, but I will go in after usually and create some sky holes. So if I know that there's some around in here, I might just lay out some color for now. And I'm just sort of loosely painting this in here. And I am not trying to do details right now. This is not a painting about details. This is a painting about structure. Let's see, I'm just gonna kind of overpaint, so I've got some paint down to make things a little bit interesting later. And then I'm going to take this greener color and start bringing it. And you know what? I think I'll let maybe a little bit of my lines come through for now. I'm not going to overpaint this. I kind of want you to be able to see them. Just a little bit up here. And again, okay, here's the other thing. Keeping this in the green and purple tone around my focal point, which is going to be here, is going to allow a play of temperature when I create my focal point, because I can add some warms in there. So now I'm going to take this mix and I'm going to add a little bit of my ultramarine blue. That is way too much. It needs to be quite a bit lighter than that. But now I've got this interesting variation of these colors to start bringing up into here. So already my sky is not a flat color. It's already kind of interesting. There's quite a few variations of blue going on in there. And I've got a gradient that goes from light to dark, from the bottom to the top. And again, you can just brush some of this in here. You can add water. Don't worry about adding water too much to your acrylics, guys. It doesn't mess them up that much. I have never had a painting fall apart because I added water to it. And I've got some paintings that are like 20 years old now almost. All right. That's the green, and then the hills come down there. Perfect. So let's start tackling these greens. Oh, and here's another thing that I do, actually, since we're at it, and we know that the water, let me see, I'm going to add a little bit of white to this. I want it to be darker, so I don't want to go as light as my lightest color up there. But I do want to start creating some of these, and I'm just sort of drawing across water. The details tend to be horizontal, so I am just going to quickly lay some of this in and then go in with some of my ultramarine blue one. So I have similar colors in the sky, and I'm just going to lay this out, but I will probably go in with some darks and some blacks and some greens and other things later. But at least at this point, I have something for those colors, the detail colors, to sit on. Kind of mix up a bit more in my pile, get a little bit of a variation in there. It's too blue right now, don't worry. This is just the first little iteration. We're going to come in with a lot more interest after this. Okay, now our greens. Let's tackle, it's easiest, I think, to tackle the background first. We're actually starting off pretty well here with these mixes. So I've got some ultramarine blue and white mixed up here. I'm actually just going to take a whole bunch of black and some of my yellow. Oops, that was too far. So the yellow on this actually needs to be quite subtle. And again, we need it to be fairly light in color, and we need it to be a cool blue. I'm going to add a little bit of magenta. So I'm trying to keep to the purple tones. Let me see this. So you'll notice this is like almost a purple on gray. So I do need to add a little bit more yellow to this. I want it to sort of hint towards yellow, but I want it to be quite desaturated. Let me see a little bit more color here. And this is way too dark, so I'm going to add some more light or white to this. And a little bit more ultramarine blue. There we go. That's not too bad. And it will look kind of gray. Like, don't worry about it. This is maybe a little bit too dark right now. Oh, I'm going to add some little trees in there, but I can do that after. So I'm going to add a little bit more white to this. This will help to create some of that depth back in here. Oh, right, I brought that down. That's good. Okay. And then we're coming a little bit forward. So I am going to add, let me see here. I'm just going to add a little bit more white into this because there is a little background hill here that is a little bit farther away and I want to create that distance. All right, and then I'm coming forward a bit, so I'm actually going to add some more yellow, and I'm going to let it warm up a little bit with black. So black will warm your yellows. Let this come up into here. As you can see, I am really not aiming for details in this painting. I am literally just trying to mass some shapes. I'm going to go a little bit lighter, a little bit more yellow. And maybe a bit warmer with black. Black will create a warmer green than a blue and yellow. So remember, this plane is facing upwards. I don't have to go to my lightest light yet. I can just mass in sort of a mid-tone color for this. And then let me see, I'm going to go a little bit more yellow and a little bit more white. So every time I add more yellow, it starts to saturate it a little bit further. And actually, this is where I'm going to start sort of tinting my color even warmer by adding a little bit of pyrrole orange in there. So I'm still going to be getting a green, surprisingly, but it's going to start being even a little bit warmer. And when I look at this reference, I see reds in those greens. A little bit of white here. It's going to be the brightest spot because the sun is hitting it. So again, we are not detail painting. This is color blocking. This is just an exercise to start understanding color. And I'm going to go, because I'm coming closer, a little bit more yellow, a little bit more orange. If it starts to be too orange, throw a little bit of black in there. The black and yellow create a green. And then let's add a little bit more white in here just to bring up the value. That's a little bit too orange, so I'm going to add a little bit more white. So I'm kind of using the colors that I've laid down as a reference. And then I'm mixing from those into other colors. So I'm going to need a little bit more value contrast in here later, but it almost starts to be a detail thing, so I don't actually want to get into it because I don't want to do detail on this painting. Okay, so there is some just shapes and grasses coming up in here. And then we're coming forward again. Let's see, I'm just going to throw a little bit down in here. But we're coming forward again. So I'm doing my highlights right now, obviously. And we're coming forward again, so this needs to get brighter and more saturated and warmer. So more yellow, more orange, whoops, more white, and a little bit of black. Okay, I'm gonna actually add more white. And more yellow to make sure that it stays more saturated. There we go. Even more. And here's the thing, white desaturates. So if I really want to bring out the saturation of this later, I can actually go over and glaze some lighter, more saturated colors, transparent color over these areas. So what I can do is actually lighten them a little bit too far and then glaze. Because see, adding white like this just like desaturates everything. You need it to bring up the value, but it kills your saturation. Okay, so now let's talk about shadows because it's primarily in the tree, but also I want to just create some of the areas in here. I'm going to go darker on a lot of this, but I want to just create some space for these leaves here that are catching the light from my focal point, which is that sun. Because it's going to tilt a little bit warmer and brighter around in here. So I'll just throw a little bit of this in right now because it's on my brush. And I actually don't think that I'm going to need more than that. I am going to have to create more contrast later, but at least I've got some area here for that light. Let's talk about the shadows now. So in the foreground, this is where we can go quite dark and warm. Oops. So I want actually quite a bit of black in here. I've got way too much weight on my brush. I'm going to grab another one. So I want this to be quite dark because remember our contrast in the foreground, the difference between the lightest and the darkest is a lot higher. So by mixing yellow and black, I am getting a warm, saturated, dark green. And in here, there's just kind of all kinds of darks. And I'm still close in distance quite a bit right here, so I can just sort of use the same color. I'm going to do something a little bit different with that bush after because I want it to stand out, so I'm going to vary the green there. Let me see, I'm going to come into here with some of these. And again, as you can see, this is quite sloppy. I am not painting detail. I am not trying to paint detail. All right, so I'm going to go backwards a little bit in space. So I don't want my greens to be quite as dark, and I'm going to add a little touch of blue in there, and I might even add a little bit of warmer blue. So with the cerulean, just in some of these areas. We're still quite close, so I don't need to desaturate it that much. And I'm just aiming right now for my kind of my darkest darks. I'm not really going for mid-tone here. I'm just getting like highlight, average highlight and average shadow. I'm actually going to add a little bit of white to this to bring up the value slightly and desaturate it slightly, and this will become the shadow for along in here. And then over here, I actually have a lighter sort of area of grass. It's sort of a mid-tone, and it's sort of in a similar color and value range. So I'm just going to block this in and add some more highlights in there after, but I can just sort of get these sort of mid-tones. And I'm actually going to take this green and do, let me see, actually I need black again first. And if I do that sun a little bit warm, a little trick that I can do is add a bit of purple into these darks here. Remember, value-wise, my tree has to be the darkest. So by adding purple in here, because it's a complementary color to yellow, when I add my yellow highlights for the sun, it gives a nice temperature contrast to sit against. All right, in here, this needs to be a green, but it needs to be a purple green. So I'm gonna mix up some green out of this pile, but then I'm gonna add some blue and magenta to it. So now I've got a green, but you can see it tilts quite purple. I'm gonna create some variation. And then this one is gonna come across here. And I will probably go and add some more highlights. So I can actually just take this mixture that I have, that's a nice warm purple green, and add a bunch of white and yellow. Just to add sort of another mid-tone color that can come across in here. And remember what I said, I stay away from my lightest lights and darkest darks for now. I'm just trying to create an overall color scheme that is interesting and working. Just this light up in here. Okay, and then I'm just gonna try to fill in the gaps here. It's gonna be some detail in there. I don't need to worry about it too much, but I do want to fill my canvas with paint. As you can see also, I am using a fairly big brush on this. Take this and I'm going to mix up more of this purpley greeny black. I have too much white in this brush, but that's okay. We'll do this color first and then I can darken it later because there's going to be actually like brighter greens. There's like variations of color in here. And you know what? I'm just going to paint this as a mass right now. And remember, nice clear silhouettes. And then I can detail around this later and I can add my sky holes, but my tree needs to be the darkest area because it is upright and it is close. And so I'm just going to fill this in. Add some more black in there maybe for the center. Gets a little bit more dense in the center. It gets a little bit darker. I need some more black paint. I never used to use black. I used to be one of those people that was like, you can't use black. You have to mix it with burnt umber and ultramarine. But actually, it just has a really powerful neutralizing effect. And it's ivory black is quite blue. I actually it's a black, but I consider it a blue because when I mix it with my yellow, I get a green, and I get quite a nice warm green. So it helps to balance all of these other colors. So just aiming for my shapes for now. And then I'm going to go and add maybe a little bit more green because the leaves get a little bit thinner down here. I still want them darker because I need them to sit out from the landscape. Okay, so there's the basic tree shape. And then for these background ones, remember our logic, they need to be a little bit cooler and a little bit less dark. So a little bit of white, a little bit of magenta and a blue, but it still needs to be fairly dark overall in value. And like there's highlights on the top of these. I can add those in later. Let's just mass out these darker values that are slightly lighter than this value and slightly less saturated. And sort of these ones here are all sort of sitting in the same distance. They're close enough that we don't need to do a major change right now. We can sort of see how it's all reading at the end and then adjust from there. Okay, now we're going back farther into distance. Move this back over. So we want to create the shadows for these ones, but they need to be, I'm gonna add a little bit more of that ultramarine blue into my greeny mix, a little bit more of my magenta, and some more white. So now this looks like a really desaturated color. But in context, it's gonna work because see how this is now much darker than the surrounding. However, as I mentioned earlier, it's not so much darker than what's close to it. So my values are becoming closer together in the distance. Make a little, this kind of can come up maybe here. Hint at like a little hill coming up in there. I can fix up those edges later. And up into here, I did have in my original little image that I ended up editing, I had some. Okay, here's another thing. You want to vary your shapes, okay? You don't want to do the same shape over and over. So different heights, different sizes, different shapes. Super important to make an interesting image. And then I'm going to go back even further. This color is already pretty good. I'm just going to add a bit more white to it. See how that works. And it should be a bit darker than what's around it. But lighter than the last shadows. And obviously the scale gets smaller as we go back, so I could probably tweak that as I keep painting forward. And then in here, I'm just going to create some, like a tree line that comes down into here. And then I can go in and paint my sky over that again. Okay, so back into this area where there is the reflection. And guys, this isn't supposed to be a masterpiece. This is just an exercise. I think sometimes we give ourselves too much pressure in doing final masterpieces every time, but that's not necessarily how we learn how to paint better and get better quickly. So I'm going to mix up some of this warm yellow with the black and the yellow, and I'm just going to, and you know what, this is maybe a bit too saturated because it's too close to the color of the grasses and things, so I'm going to add a little bit more black and maybe a couple varieties of blue in there, just so that we've got some of these colors. It's like the reflection. And then here I'm going to go just a bit more bluish, so maybe some of that ultramarine. And then back in here, it's going to be sort of reflecting a bit the colors around it, but it's going to be a bit darker. So I'm going to stay in this sort of greeny blue family, but just sort of desaturated. And just sort of help this along. I can put rocks and things back here after. Just kind of like develop my shoreline a little bit in here. It gets a little bit darker all along the shoreline. And it's also going to be carrying some of those green colors because it's reflecting, and then it's going to be catching some of the sky color, and it'll be maybe showing sometimes some of the rocks from underneath. So there can be a lot going on. So already that's created something a little bit more interesting in terms of color on the water. And I've just used the colors that I already mixed in my painting. Essentially, I'm mixing in the same pile, so everything is working together. But yeah, I'm like not worried too much about detail. And all right, so there's like areas in here that I have not addressed whatsoever. I'm actually just going to take a smaller brush because this is quite a small painting, and I'm just going to take some black here. And actually, I'm going to mix it with a bit of green because it is a bit far away. So I'll just mix into one of those piles. And I just want to create this sort of area that comes around into here. Okay, any rocks and things, I can just use a smaller angle brush. All right, in this area, over in here where it gets a little bit closer, I didn't manage to get dark enough on some of these shadows. So I'm going to start sort of bumping those up at this point. And again, I said that we're going to deal with this bush a little bit differently. I want it to stand out. So we're going to change the temperature of it slightly so that it stands out. Let me see, there's a little rock in here maybe. There's a bunch of rocks in here. Let's just place them like this first. They're sort of standing upright in the water. So they're gonna be darker. And I will create some variation in here after, but I just want to create some sort of random shapes and try not to think too much. And that sounds silly, but if you try to overthink the placement of these things, they end up looking human-made. So I tend to try to care a lot less than I used to. And the less that I care, in a way, the better my paintings get. Into here, and let me see, all down into here. Actually, I'm going to switch to a bigger brush. This is ridiculous at the moment. Too small. I don't want detail, remember? This needs to be nice and dark. And okay, don't be afraid to do loose brush stroke and vary your brush stroke. Again, we're not aiming for detail yet. We're trying to create interesting shapes. This, I'm gonna go and add some more of that purple in there because I really like it, and it's gonna help because the temperature is different. It's gonna help this tree sort of stand out amongst the rest. And let me see. Okay, so if we wanted to add a little bit more variation of color and value on some of these highlights, I'm going to add some black and yellow and white. I'm going to go even lighter. And then usually when I go lighter like this on these warm areas, I need to add a lot more yellow and a tiny bit of orange to warm it up, to bring that saturation back. This is, there we go. Now I can just kind of, without working too hard, I can add some variation and detail and highlights into some of these foreground areas. And you don't need to overdo it. I'm going to do chunky detail for now. This is a small painting. It's actually easier to paint bigger because you can use larger brushes and actually it's more precise. You can do a lot more, but I'm just going to sort of stick to some nice big shapes for now. All right, so I've got some highlights and just some like broken edges happening in here. Change up the color a bit. I've got this other pile mix. I might as well use it. I don't want to use the same color everywhere. And actually into here where these highlights are happening, it's going to be a good opportunity. Okay, this is it's too much of a contrast from the other value that's there, so I'm just going to darken it a little bit to bring it closer together, but just still add a little bit of color variation into this, just to create some interest. So as you can see, I'm working sort of within my value range that I already established with my underpainting. I'm just sort of working around it with different colors to make something that's kind of interesting. And I'm also noticing in some of these areas, there's maybe a little bit more blue-green. So this is where I can introduce a little bit of my ultramarine blue into here. Again, I'm keeping sort of in a similar value range, but just by adding these hints of a slightly different green, maybe as it goes into the shadows, it's going to give me something that's a little bit more interesting to look at. And again, I'm trying to still think of shapes. I don't want to over detail. Let's add a bit of this in here. Just a little bit of shape in there. And then this bush, I wanted it to be a slightly different blue, or green, sorry, a blue-green, in fact. It's too saturated because I did want this to stand out against its surrounding. If I had have tried to make this the same color, you would just not see it. You'd be fighting with value to try to make this work. And instead of fighting with value, you might as well use temperature. And I'm actually going to add a little bit more white in there because I do want the top of this to be illuminated a little bit. But remember, bushes are darker than their surroundings. So I'm going to be adding blue and black into my yellow mix. I can even allow this to go slightly more purple. So this is how you can create variation, so you can actually see different types of vegetation in a scene without fighting with yourself with the greens. I'm gonna add a little bit more purple in there and create my shadow. I'm just gonna add a little bit of light down into here. This is where I can start pushing and pulling temperature and value because I already have my sort of my value structure locked in. So if I'm now working around these values, so I'm not going too far to the light and too far to the dark from the sort of mid-tone that I already have, I'm going to be able to create a lot of luminosity and interest without breaking the overall structure. And again, I'm a little bit careful about using all the same color, so I might take some from in here that's a little bit more to the blue-green, just to give some pops of color. And some of these highlights might be sitting in shadow, so we can add these sort of more purple greens that are a little bit lighter in value into these shadow areas to give some interest and movement without coming out of our structure. And I actually kind of like this color for maybe in here a little bit. Just add a little bit more variation as though there's some shadows going on. It's still generally a warmer area because it's closer, but these shadows are going to tint a little bit cooler. And I'm going to add some sort of purple shadow variation. And here it's a little bit dark, so I just want to add some color movement and value movement within here. So some of these purples, lighter purples, I can add a bit of white. Add a little bit of white in here just to get it moving around a little bit. This, what I'm doing right now, it's too light, so I'm going to leave this as though it's in sort of an area that's getting a bit more skylight. But I do need to make sure that that stays darker because it's on part of the hill that is sloping up. Here's another thing that I notice about this tree. There is an area, it's still really dark, this is quite subtle, but there's an area that's sort of tinting, let me see if I can get this color, a lot warmer, even though it's quite dark. But it has like it's like where the light's hitting here on this tree, it's just sort of tinting toward the warm. I want it to be very subtle, but just adding this little hint of warmth into here is going to make something interesting. You know, I might even go a bit more yellowish in here. And it's quite watered down. I don't want it to be obvious. And around this light spot, I notice in the leaves up here, they also do this. They tint quite warm just right around the edges here. I'm just going to add some of that in here. Okay, we didn't even touch our light spot yet. I'm going to get a new brush. Let's see, what brush do I want? I'm going to take pure white and I'm going to go over here. This is not going to look good right now. We have to do a lot more to this, but I do want to start building up these values. And actually, I might have to wait for those little warm spots to dry that I've placed. And I'm just going to take some water, remove some of the paint, and just start very softly bringing some of this color out. And it's coming out from the center point. But I don't want this to be too obvious, otherwise it's going to look cartoony. So I'm going to then take this small amount and soften and lighten the color on the horizon there just very subtly. This is going to help. And you know what? You can even go over some of the edges of these trees and things back here and over your background mountain or hill. A little bit more water. Because it's going to help to sort of fade it and blur it out. As though it's sort of sitting behind a mist. But it needs to be really gentle. So this also helps to create depth and bring those values lighter and the contrast in those values closer together. So this will give, by softening these edges and sort of misting these out, it'll give the impression that there's atmosphere back in here. Oops, that was way too much paint. I don't want necessarily texture here. I like to use texture, but only where it's necessary. And generally the sun does not have texture. But I do need this area to be the lightest part of the painting. Okay, so sky holes. We're gonna jump into this now. I'm gonna mix up some of my sky colors. It can actually be a little bit darker than the sky. Often because it's going through things, the light, it darkens a little bit. But let me see. On the ground here, I'm gonna go quite light. So this part I didn't address at all. So I just want to sort of fill this in. And again, I'm not using little brushes right now. This is not a detail painting. I'm using large brushes to try to stop myself from overworking. All right, I'm actually going to take a brush with black on it, pure black, and I'm going to decide right now, where are these branches, these main branches? And I'm just going to lay some shapes in here because I want to know where I should put. That's fine, I'll fix that. I know where it is, so that's all that's important. I can go back in and darken these and redraw them. I just kind of want to decide sort of where my masses are so that I can create some sort of sky holes in here. So I'm going to take my light color, and there's obviously going to be some leaves too. So I'm just going to try to create what could be some interesting shapes. This is where I just start to break up my sky, break up my tree shapes, break up the edges. And there's going to obviously be a whole bunch more spots that are closer to the edges where the leaves and the branches are a little bit thinner. I've gone a little bit too dark with this. I'm just going to add some more white to it. There we go. I'm trying to match closely. Okay, I'm being too noisy right now. I'm just going to say this is an error that I'm doing, that I see that I'm doing. So I am going to pull back and, again, think more about shapes, not a noisy detail. I want to keep the silhouettes easy to read. And then there's probably going to be some up in here. And you can go, like, you can do more and more layers and go more and more into detail. But I don't, like I said, I don't want this to be a detail painting, so we're not going to make it a detail painting. For this cloud, I haven't really dealt with it, and it's going to compete with my light spot. So I'm just going to mix up a little bit of my sky color with a little bit of black and maybe a little bit of, oops, that's a lot. I'm going to go a little bit purple, but quite desaturated. This is a soft cloud. It's kind of almost invisible. I don't need to go That's a beautiful lilac. I don't need to go too dark with this. And I just want to create some shadows and some sort of soft shapes that are not too obvious. The painting is not about this cloud. It's just sort of something to add some interest to that corner, and also to create that little device here that brings our eye in toward our light spot here. So I'm not going to do much more than this. Okay, a little bit more detail stuff. I'm going to take my smaller brush, and I need a desaturated green that is bluish or purplish. It's actually a purple green. So magenta, quinacridone orange, and my ultramarine blue, and a whole bunch of white. Ooh. What I'm wanting to do here is to create some highlights for the ground in the back. And I just want to see what I've got here. That's way too warm. So I always like to test a little spot and add a lot more blue to this. It's still way too warm. It's also too light. So I'm just going to pull some of this color aside. Add more blue. And let's see how this goes. That's a bit better. I think I'm going to add a little bit more white, and there's a bit of green in that white. I'm going to say that because it will change the color a little bit, but here we go. So what I'm doing is creating a value change, and I know that's going to darken actually when it dries, so I'm going to go a little bit lighter. I want to create a value change so that I can clean the edge of this up. And I just want to make it so there's like the top of a hill back in here. But the values and the colors need to remain quite close, and they need to remain quite cool and desaturated. Just enough to create some visual interest, and then I'm coming forward to the next one so we can add a little bit of yellow in there using that color that I just used, but a little bit more saturated. Let's see how this goes. A little bit more saturated and a little bit warmer. Create some little highlights back in here, and I know the colors are going to darken as they dry, so that's probably good. And then coming forward a little bit more, I'm going to add some more white to this and some more yellow. So now I can actually add more contrast because it's getting closer. Just to vary this a little bit. It's not really detail, but it's just sort of cleaning up my edges. And then again, coming closer so I can add more white and yellow. It's not saturated enough. I can tell because I can look at this area and I see that that is too far of a jump for where it is in space. And I'm just going to clean up some of these little lines. And now around my light spot. Okay, that is detail painting. I'm being very bad right now. I'm gonna add some orange to this. And just in here where the light or the leaves, sorry, are thin, I am going to add some of this warm color to it. And I'm just trying to kind of respect my shapes that I've already made in here. And I don't need to detail this whole tree. We want people to look here. This is supposed to be where, this is the area that our painting is about. So I'm actually going to sort of reserve detail for this area. You don't want to detail the whole thing. You want to detail where you want people to look. There are also going to be some of these colors reflecting into the water down here, and I'm just going to go below this area. Add a bit of water. Because water reflects what is around it. And so it is reflecting all of the stuff that's happening above. There might be some bit of glow in and around these rocks also. All right, I'm going to go in and just bump up some of my highlights. That is not saturated enough, but it brought my value up and I can play with it after with glazes. Add a bit more yellow. Often if you go brighter, you have to add a lot more of your other saturated colors in there. There we go, that's better. So now I can bring in some strong saturations. All right, in here, and maybe some just like back in here, and also up into here, almost pure yellow even. Yellow-orange. It's surprisingly still going to read as green. You can push this really far, it's surprising. Sort of color mixing alchemy. Okay, so like I mentioned, after a little technical glitch, I want to take my white here, and I'm actually going to water it down. Yeah, quite a bit actually. I'm going to water it down. I always glaze, or not glaze, I always varnish my paintings at the end, so I'm basically putting a thick coat of plastic on them anyways. Seriously, this paint is not going anywhere. It's going to stay there. And I'm just going to, like, in straight lines, I'm just going to sort of draw up and out and around. And just kind of nice and soft. And you really want this to be brighter at the center, and you want it to fade out. So these effects can be quite cheesy, I will say. So you have to be careful with them. So we will glaze after to make them a little bit more subtle. But I just want to make sure that my light is wrapping around this area. So I'm going to go a little bit more opaque in here because we kind of start, it's so bright, it's so like oversaturated that we start losing this edge. The detail starts to disappear in here. And I am going to let this dry, and then I am going to come in with, actually think just a little bit, let me see, it's got to be quite clean, my brush. And I'm going to come in with a little bit of the pyrrole orange and my yellow. They're both transparent colors. And you know what? That is too hot. I think it actually needs a little bit of magenta also. Move it over here maybe. All right, and so I've got quite a bit of color over there to work in and with. I need it to be fairly watered down actually. And I am just going to come in here and around these edges to soften these whites. I'm just going to glaze a bit of that in there. All right. And just kind of gently and softly. I'm not trying to do the whole thing evenly. I want to create some variation, but I just want to give that glow that the light's coming through there. And then down here, oops, I don't want that green. There was green on my brush. I'm just going to add a little bit more white with a tiny bit of blue in it. And I'm going to add my highlights for the water down in here. I should not be using this small brush I am detailing right now, but that's a bit where we're at. So now I'm just trying to balance out some interest because we have our focal point established. It's quite obvious. We've got our overall structure that is obvious. And then so from here, I would go in and start doing details over top of this. But this is what your painting should kind of look like before you try to detail everything. Once you get a handle on this and you feel comfortable, you can use a little bit more of an organic painting method where you're sort of going a little bit more towards final painting earlier. But I really, really recommend, if you're struggling, try to do a few paintings like this, where you're not painting detail and you're just trying to get the overall structure first. And I feel like you're gonna just be a lot happier in the end because you're gonna struggle a lot less. So at this point, I just look for nitpicky stuff that's like in my sort of not resolved that I've already done. Like this area, there's a lot of white in my brush. This area is not dark enough as a shadow at the moment. And there's some variation in there. So I'm also like, as you notice too, I'm also kind of drawing with my brush, even though I'm not detailing, I'm kind of drawing with my brush in the direction that the landscape moves. So like this hill goes upward. So the little lines that I'm creating, like this, show me how this hill is moving. Just balance it by putting a little bit more on this side. It's fairly watered down, but I can just add a little bit of detail and movement over here. Some warmer shadow in through here since I'm got this on my brush. So now I've got like a mix of purples and greens and blues. There's so many colors going on in here, even though I actually haven't used all that many colors of paint, really. And I definitely did not take this out of a tube. This is, well, I took the colors out of a tube, but I didn't go straight out of a tube and just mix white or whatever. You want to create a little bit more variation than that. If you want to add some lightness in your leaves, again, I'm just going to stick with shapes here. I don't want to detail this. It's too small. But if you want to create a few more sort of a little bit more volume and a little bit more interest on this silhouette, and it's usually around the parts where things are thinnest. So sort of around these light holes that you made already, or the sky holes, you can just go in. And I would just stick to my silhouette shapes. And just hint that there's some depth. Doing exercises like this too will stop you from over painting. You want to be looking more at the overall work and less at all the little details. And again, because I want to sort of like make this area the most important. So I'm detailing more here, but we can also add some dark, strong purple notes in here in my shadows. And it's gonna help to make these warm really stand out. And I can be subtle with this, but I just like, if I'm putting purples next to yellows, my yellows are gonna stand out. And it's just in the shadow, but it just creates some interesting color harmonies. And your eye will most definitely pick up on them. Down here. There we go. So definitely not a final detailed painting by any means, but in this very quick exercise, we managed to capture sort of the direction that this painting could go. We've got our depth established, our shapes are clear, we know what our focal point is, we have pathways leading to it. At this point, if you wanted to continue adding details and refining shapes, that's what you would do. Like you could go in with your tiny little brushes, let's say, you could go in a little bit of black just to make this green. Actually, I'm going to take this blue just to make it a little bit green, and that is not saturated enough. But you could, oh, there we go. You could start coming in here with a smaller brush, and in key areas, start just pulling out, you know, some detail just to clean up these edges. You could go in with some glazes to help with the saturation in the foreground, so that it's just with transparent pure color that's very subtle over top. You can go in with more shadow at this point. Let me see, I'm gonna make like a really dark shadow, and then you can start sort of making more variation and just sort of random shapes in this sort of mess that we made. And it's just easy to build this way. And again, like try to think of clumps. Try not to think of like too much detail. You want to hint at things more than hit people with them. So I can create some subtle shapes and variations on this foreground bit here. Clean up those edges there. I can go back in. Let's see, I'm going to do some gray, and maybe I'm going to actually make a gray that is a purpley blue color and quite desaturated. So that I can sort of create some, it's too bright. Those would be good highlights for rocks, but what I want are rocks. So I can just kind of create some chattered noise over here where there's all those little rocks. And this is where you can start sort of detailing things and pulling out highlights and shadows that are on a more sort of micro level. We've been working kind of macro at this point. So you can start pulling out details that are more micro. Like if you want to pull out the highlights on these rocks or shadow some things, this would be the time to do it. So you can start putting all this in. A little rock right here. And again, as you can see, I am not being too precious. I get a little bit more precious on my larger paintings, mostly because I have the space and also because I've already done this work for myself. I already know where I'm heading with it. So this is already sort of working in my mind as I'm working on the bigger pieces that are more detailed. And I'm just, I am layering detail as I do it. But in my mind, this is what's happening first, and then the detail is kind of going on top. I just can, because I'm used to this now, I can skip the step. So definitely, I think if you guys can do some studies like this, where there is focusing on value, saturation, a variety of colors and shape and composition, and just do a few studies like this. They're pretty quick to do. And then you'll have like a whole bunch of nice little paintings that you can appreciate. And then that is going to help you move forward a lot more quickly than if you just try to continually do like really detailed stuff without sort of doing this analysis of what's happening underneath the paintings. So I hope that was helpful. This is definitely how I like to approach things, and I spent a bunch of time doing it, and it really helped me out. I've also done this exercise just in black and white, where I tried to just nail the values. And if you want to glaze, for example, this part I keep talking about glazing and I'm not doing it, so I'm just gonna show you what I mean. A glaze is basically, if I want this area to be really saturated as a warmer green, I already have a lot of colors sitting there. So this is just gonna go over top. These colors, ooh, that's very orange. These colors here, the yellow and the orange, are transparent colors. I want just a tiny little bit of this paint on here, no white. And then I wait for it to dry. And then if I come over and just do this, you can see how hot and how saturated I can make this. And also glazing yellow over black. It's a little bit wet still, but whatever. Glazing yellow over black will also help, or will also turn it green. Sorry, it won't help, it'll turn it green. So if I really am I'm not really seeing the depth enough because my foreground isn't saturated enough because I had to add too much white, I can then come over and just sort of dance over where my highlights are to sort of create a look of being more saturated. And I don't want to, like, I've already made all these beautiful colors by doing all this mixing. I don't want to create like a solid glaze over the whole thing because that's just going to kill all that work that I did, because it kind of will turn it a bit all the same color in a way. But I can definitely just come and put little bits, and it is going to overall saturate it without killing all those fantastic variations that I made. So now I've got something that's a whole lot more saturated. I could do this in the water too, because there's like all those. This is a reflection of the tree above, so I can just sort of saturate it this way. And even in here, I can come over, oops, that's too much, and there might be a bit of white in there. I'm not waiting for it to dry, guys. It's better if you wait a couple hours, but I can come in here and just sort of touch some of this color in. And get that saturation back. And you know what, maybe even in here, I'm gonna add a little bit, but I might actually desaturate that just a little with my black. I still want it to be brighter, but I don't want it to be quite as saturated because it does sit back. So I can just add that in there a bit, little touches of it. And it just helps to bring up the overall saturation. So yeah, I hope you found that useful. Quick little messy study painting, but super, super useful to do, and it will just skyrocket your rate of improvement very quickly by doing these exercises. So have a great day, and I can't wait to see you guys again. Bye bye.